Morning, evening, Patricia. How are you?
Oh, good. Good evening. Oh, hang on. I'll just get my camera set up. Very well. I'm just I'll come back in a few minutes. I was just checking that all the linking worked.
Okay,
Hang
no
on.
problem. No problem.
Yeah,
It's nice to see you.
yeah. Hang on. There we go. I'll turn it on. If that will work now. Yeah, there are. Yep. Good. Okay. Well, thank you for this. I'm looking forward to.
Again, good morning. While we are waiting, I think there should be some more people that are joining. But welcome to those who are joining the KZN Network session for the first time. This is a SAMIA network, and we have monthly meetings on Saturday mornings, generally 9 to 11, where we cover quite a range of different topics, sometimes very theoretical, sometimes very practical. There are some other people on the call from the network, and maybe Tamlin and Marilyn and Nokwazi and others can just say hello so that the KZN people are visible.
Morning, everyone.
Hi, everyone. It's Quasi here.
Hi, Daniel here.
Great. So I just as a point of introduction, so I'm sure many of you know Professor Ian Goldman, but just as point of introduction, so Professor Ian Goldman wears many hats. He is an adjunct professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at UCT. He is also currently the president of the International Evaluation Academy, as well as an advisor on evaluation and evidence systems with CLEAR-AA, the Global Evaluation Initiative, and Climate Investment Funds. He is a board member of SAMIA with me and co-leads with me on the M&E for Just Transition thematic area, as well as being part of the thematic area looking at M&E for adaptive situations, particularly looking at adaptive learning. But today he is here as a passionate advocate for taking decisive action in terms of regenerating our ecosystems and reducing our carbon emissions. It's a very fitting discussion today, being Earth Day. I mean, every day we should be caring about our Earth, but today is a special reminder of that. So, yeah, Ian, you're very welcome to maybe introduce yourself a little bit more. I think there will be more people coming in as we get going, but feel free to get going.
Fine, and just to acknowledge that we've got a couple of other board members, Taku Chirao and Ruth Machalefa, on the call. And Patricia, it's wonderful to have you from Australia. And we've been collaborating with Patricia and Andy Rowe and the team on the excellent work they're doing with Footprint, which we're learning from and sharing with as well. So let me share. There we go. And the one downside with being in this garage is I don't have my big monitor, so I just have to manage with my small screen. So what I'm going to talk about is the climate ecosystems health criteria and guidelines, and Jen led on the development of the equity criteria and guidelines, and a woman called Tracy Bailey and I led on the on the CEH criteria and guidelines. and we're just talking about the latter at the moment. And I'm going to try and cover is why we need to act immediately, not 2030, not 2050, but immediately, to highlight that we actually have most of the answers, but vested interest, corruption, disinformation, and inertia are the challenge. We can take a couple of questions at that point, and then we'll look a bit at the criteria and take some questions about that, and then talk about applying the criterion and using the guideline. And I'll hopefully do a bit of an exercise with you to get you into thinking about it and trying to apply it yourself. And then we'll take some final questions, and I'll aim to finish by about 10:05. So firstly, why we need to act now. Oh no. Oh no. Sorry, what's happened in reducing the size.
Are you using the PDF or are you using the PowerPoint?
No, I'm using the PowerPoint. For some reason, when I put it in full screen mode, it's not showing the pictures. Oh, it is showing it when I, okay, I'm just going to, let me do a quick, I'm going to have to do a quick change to another presentation. So last year, 1/3 of Pakistan was flooded, and this is the scale of the challenge that we're facing. We've been hitting in China.
Ian, there's no presentation being shown at the moment.
Okay, sorry.
And while he's getting that up, I put into the chat a link that has the, it goes to the 2 criteria that were developed through the hackathon.
Okay, are you seeing now?
Yes.
Okay, so in Pakistan, 1/3 of Pakistan was flooded last year, and we're seeing temperatures 10 degrees higher than normal in China now. Everybody thought that New Zealand was a haven of peace and tranquility. Well, they just had some massive cyclones. Argentina and Uruguay, 8 to 10 degrees above normal. Australia, the heating in some of the rivers is leading to massive fish die-off. And of course, the reason is about the temperature rise. We're already at 1.2 degrees above the 1850 to 1900 average. And it's not a case of the absolute amount of the temperature. The point is that the climate equilibrium has been destabilized. And we've been in the Holocene in 10,000 years of pretty benign temperature, which humans have now destabilized. And the more that the average temperature goes up, the more instability there will be in the climate system. And that will mean there will be more extremes, including both, for example, Arctic temperatures descending into North America, but also the massive heat and heat waves that we're seeing. And in South Africa, of course, in KZN, you've really felt the brunt of it. So this was the floods, and it didn't only hit poor people, it hit rich people, the Knysna wildfires, and the massive problems of water we're experiencing in Gqeberha, and I experienced in Cape Town. And then recently the cyclone, which hit Madagascar and Mozambique, it lasted for 39 days, and it was the most powerful cyclone, the most powerful storm ever. So this is the scale of the challenge we're facing. And of course, it's caused by the rise in carbon dioxide. And we've gone way above the levels that they've been historically. I mean, in billions of years ago, we've had this level, but of course the climate and the sea levels, etc., have been completely different. But so in our Holocene period, we've been experiencing this very benign period. We are taking it into unknown territory. And when we look at the carbon dioxide that's being emitted, the black line at the left is how emissions have risen. The red line is showing what if we were to implement policies that are currently planned for, we're going to lead to a warming of probably around about 3.2 degrees. And if we need to limit our warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, we need a absolutely dramatic cut off of emissions now in a way which means really very dramatic national change, like we saw with COVID-19. We can't just do this incrementally and slowly if we're going to move into a safe environment. And 3 years ago, I was putting on my social media thing that we needed 7% emissions cuts per year. We now need 10% emissions cuts per year. That is incredibly dramatic. And for South Africa, it means instead of just thinking about, what do we do bit by bit? We've got the challenge with Eskom, but we've got to use that challenge to also work out how we can cut our emissions in a very dramatic way. And as South Africa is the 14th biggest emitter, it's not just a passive bystander in this. And as in a recent Business Day article, the country could become an apocalyptic wasteland if it fails to take future proofing seriously. And current crises such as water shortages and load shedding exist because we ignored the initial warning signs, as we're doing with the environment. Now, this problem is particularly a problem caused by rich people, not by lots of poor people. It's caused by rich people. So when we look at the top, so the left-hand bar is the proportions, the top 1%, the global population share. When we look at the contribution to global emissions, you can see that the top 1% is producing 15% of global emissions. The next 9% is producing 34% of global emissions. So the top 10% are producing half of all emissions. And if we're earning the average formal sector in salary in South Africa of 24,000 Rand a month, this would put you in the richest 12% in the country. So all of us in this room are in that bracket. So we are the ones who are causing the emissions, who are causing the waste, who are causing the overconsumption of resources, etc. And it's our lifestyles that actually have to change, while we need to enhance the life and the well-being of the poorest 90% of the population. So we've got the cars, we've got the houses, we're eating lots of meat, we consume the clothes, we consume the electronics, we're flying, it's our lifestyles that have to change. The problem is not just climate, the problem is also around ecosystems. And we have our domestic livestock now account for a huge proportion of the total biomass in the world, both the humans ourselves, but also actually the biomass of domestic livestock. And our farming systems are causing problems with antibiotics, mass antibiotic resistance. We are also causing a massive loss of plant species, of insect species, etc. And there's, as some of you may know, there's a big risk to bees, which pollinate most of our feed crops. And if we go for a 1.5 degree scenario, there's a severe challenge to all of these areas, from plant species, insects, coral reefs, it's extreme heat, etc. But if we move to 2 degrees, the problem gets not just 1/3 or a quarter worse, it gets much worse. So for example, with coral reefs, we move to 99% decline in coral reefs. As coral reefs are the home to 25% of the fish, that's a huge loss to fish species, etc., etc. So we're causing a huge damage to climate and to the ecosystems. And above all, it's us being turned into materialists and consumers. And we've been taught by advertising, by the forces of capitalism, to believe that we're only happy if we consume, and that everything can be exploited for the benefits of humans, and a few humans at that. We're taught that that is normal, that is inevitable, and that the benefits will trickle down, but they're not trickling down. They're trickling up to the rich people. And the potential consequences we can see of social breakdown. This is in the riots in KZN. And this could be our future if we don't deal with both the potential climate and ecosystem effects, because they affect poor people much, much more than rich people, but they're caused by rich people. And, you know, what the sort of disasters might mean for society. So we're supposed to cut emissions by 45% by 2030 to stand a chance of keeping up to keeping the temperature down to 1.5 degrees, but they're increasing. And there's lots of lobbies which are pushing to disinform. And that has delayed action because many politicians, if you look at, for example, how many congressmen in the US and how many MPs in the UK actually receive an income from the fossil fuel companies, it's very shocking. We can change things, but there are great dangers of tipping points where the earth takes over and we can no longer influence. For example, if the permafrost started to defrost. When it defrosts, it releases methane. When it releases methane, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide. It will cause more warming, which will cause more permafrost to defrost. So if we don't change these cycles, we move into tipping points where we no longer have control because the Earth's cycles will start to take over. Another one is the Arctic, where when the Arctic is covered with ice, it reflects a lot of the sunlight, the albedo effect. But if it doesn't, and a lot of it melts, and we have blue sea, it absorbs sunlight, so it warms up more, so more ice melts. So we're in great danger of these tipping points taking over. So what we're trying to say is that we have to start to move to mainstream thinking about climate change, ecosystems, health, and equity into all decisions if we're to stand a chance of saving a habitable planet and well-being for all. And this is not something for the future. The longer we delay, the more those graphs of how we've got to cut emissions become cliffs and mean that we have to have, you know, a complete economic standstill to be able to deal with it. So we have to deal with this as an emergency, and we have to move away from seeing nature as something that's there to be exploited to an understanding that only through a healthy ecosystem can humans thrive. And that this is very closely integrated with the problems of equity. And it's only that when we are dealing with structural social deprivation at the same time that we will actually deal in a just way with the transitions that we have to address. Now, we have most of the answers, but vested interests, corruption, disinformation, and inertia are the challenge. So, for example, we've known that the Exxon oil company has known since the late 1970s that its fossil fuel products could lead to additional warming. Now, they had climate scientists which have predicted in great accuracy the warming that has happened, and they have very deliberately started to muddy the waters of climate science from that point, deliberately. They are responsible, they're going to be responsible for millions and millions of deaths, not only of humans, but of other species. Due to their seeking short-term profits at the expense of the planet. Now, we actually have many of the answers. I mean, when you look at the rollout of renewables, for example, in China, it is completely incredible the amount that's being rolled out. And in fact, many other countries are beginning to, and thank God for the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is starting to really push on renewables. If we had carried on implementing renewables after our first round of the renewable energy investment plan, we would have had no load shedding and we would be progressing on our targets. But it's because of the impact of vested interests on government which has delayed us. There are many other areas where we know some of the answers. Industrial agriculture is one of the big problems in its own right, both in terms of causing carbon emissions, but also in terms of its devastating effect on ecosystems. Here's an example of ecological farming in Limpopo, organic farming. Here's an example of a design of a shopping center, quite old now in Harare, which is not cooled by air conditioning. It's cooled using an air ventilation system modeled on termites. Another one of the biggest effects is through livestock, and particularly feedlot. Industrial livestock is a massive producer of carbon emissions, as well as producing very devastating effects on the livestock themselves. So personal choices that we can make about reducing our meat consumption, not necessarily cutting it out, but reducing it, is one of the classic ways that we can reduce our impacts. There are all sorts of experiments happening with new cheap forms of building which require less emissions. This is an electric bus in Cape Town. There's work happening in KZN to work on the ecosystems using expanded public works models, etc. There's the wind power, which is being rolled out in South Africa. And this is my own solar on my roof. And in the last year, I've spent something like 1,200 Rand on electricity, because the rest I've managed to produce myself. Action is happening. We have the draft climate change bill, which is going through, and we have the framework for just transition in South Africa. But as with a lot that happens in South Africa, it all takes time. And time is the one thing that we don't have. So we have to put a lot of pressure on to move quickly. So we must act quickly to stay within 1.5 degrees, which is a safe-ish limit. Any more is highly dangerous, but we're on course for over 3 degrees. The ecosystem limits we're transgressing are very serious: water pollution, species extinction. We do have the answers, but there's been an inadequate commitment and urgency to bring these in. Our policy actions are taking us in the right direction, but we have to increase the urgency, and the next 5 years are absolutely critical. So with that, I want to just say we can take a couple of questions, and I'm hoping that the rest of my former presentation has not, the pictures have not been damaged. So while I'm just see if there's any questions on that, I'm just going to link up to my other presentation, and I hope that will work. Any questions that people have? See, is there something in the chat? Okay, no questions there.
Yeah, any burning questions, any reflections?
Good morning. Good morning.
Good
Prof
morning, Ruth.
Ian and everyone.
Hi, Ruth.
Yeah, yes. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and indeed we are learning. I'm just saying it's just basic questions. They may not really referring to your presentation, but somehow they may be related. For example, what's the difference between CEH guideline and just for transition guideline? Is it the same thing? Because like in our board meeting, we talk about just for transition guideline at the same time. So is it the same thing? And then, by the way, H is CH is climate ecosystem. H is what? Just remind me. Thanks.
Jen, can I just hand over you to answer, and I'm going to just try and recover my presentation while you're doing that.
Sure, I'll try. Okay, so first the H is health, but it's ecosystems health as one kind of concept. So the CEH criterion, which Ian will be describing now, and the guidelines that were developed to go with that are one set. And then during the hackathon and since the hackathon, we've also been working on a criterion on transformative equity and a set of guidelines that go with that. And together, we're packaging them together to address just transition. But just transition in our framing is a bit more beyond how just transition is kind of conceived of, in terms of moving away from the fossil fuels and ensuring that people that are working within those sectors that we need to move from, that there are safety nets, there are ways of transitioning them that is respectful and equitable and so on. For us, just transition is actually more around like maintaining or establishing planetary health in a way that is really recognizing the balance between humanity and our ecosystems and the flora and the fauna, and that we are all interconnected. And I don't know, Ian, if you're ready, but maybe also Patricia at some point can talk a little bit about the footprint evaluation, which is also a very similar way of thinking about these issues and how evaluation needs to be taking this on and how it can take it on. Are you?
I need another minute, so maybe.
Okay, so
just
Patricia,
get
maybe
the-
if you want to just briefly come in on footprint evaluation.
Sure. Sorry, let me get this on again. Yeah. Welcome everyone. I'm calling from Australia, and I'm really interested in what's going on here, because what you're working on is actually how do you embed it in government, so that these things are looked at not just when you're doing environmental programs, but all programs, because lots of non-environmental programs have environmental impacts. So Ian talked about agriculture. We know that the way that buildings are designed and built has huge environmental impacts, and it's not an environmental program. So I'm really interested in this guideline, because it's very much making the case as to why this is important, but then also how do you do it? I'm working with Andy Rowe, Jane Davidson, Kay Stevens, and Alice McFarlane in a group called the Footprint Evaluation Initiative, and we're also looking at how do you embed looking at environmental sustainability into all programs. And as with the just transition, equity's got to be part of that. So it's not saying, you know, animals before people. It's very much about the looking after people. They need a healthy ecosystem. So we've been looking at a couple of examples of how we do this practically, and what that actually means for, you know, working evaluators and working evaluation managers, because you can't just suddenly turn around and do a whole environmental impact assessment on every program that you're evaluating. So how do you identify some important things that are going to add value? So I'm happy to share a few links to that at the end. And hopefully, Ian, you're ready now to take us on.
Thanks, Patricia.
Yeah.
Ian, before you go, there is a question in the chat from Tim. Tim, do you want to just say it? I mean, I'm happy to read it, but it's also good to get other voices.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Ian. Let me just read out my question. I said, thank you very much for this presentation. There was a strong focus on individual contribution to climate emissions in the presentation. But in my opinion, we need coordinated action led by governments and the private sector to implement scalable climate solutions. So the example I gave was in Amsterdam, there's a city planning which has encouraged the citizens in the city to cycle instead of driving. So that's just one example, but I'm just wondering, so, you know, if we combine government policy and the private sector being incentivized to take action, how do we reconcile that with the emphasis on taking individual action when the system that we live in shapes how we live?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Tim. So I was just emphasizing that individual, because I think it's important for people to realize this is not a problem out there. This is a problem that we are causing. The question is, does the system support the changes that we need? And the answer is it doesn't. So we absolutely need system change. So we need, for example, we need public transport and electrified public transport to be available for people to use. Otherwise, you know, you will use a car if or, you know, if there's no safe cycle ways or places to walk. So we need system change, and we need the way all the incentives are working in society to work in a way which encourages government, private sector, etc., to work in ways which are conducive to the climate and environment. Definitely.
With you.
And
Thank you.
I think what we'll be talking about in terms of the guidelines, what we're trying to see is how can we mainstream this thinking into all programs and policies across government. That's what we're trying to focus on.
Right. Thank you.
Shall I go on then, Jen? There's something else in the chat, I think.
There is another question in the chat. But I don't know if you are able to answer that now, or maybe we can discuss it.
Maybe discuss it later. Yeah. Okay, so let me just go into the criterion a bit. So firstly, when we're seeing climate health as global temperatures returning to safe levels with regenerated carbon sinks, and we're seeing ecosystems health as the capacity of ecosystems to remain stable, sustainable, and resilient to external influences, therefore supporting a diversity of life forms and providing key benefits to society. This is actually in the guideline. And the guideline is, by the way, it's about to be issued by DPME. It's being laid out at the moment. And we need to think about the work that we're doing and whatever intervention we're involved in, whether it's National School Nutrition Program or rural development programs, etc., how do they affect climate and systems health? Are they degenerative? Do they follow the business as usual model of we take lots of resources, we make things, we use things, and then we dispose and create lots of waste problems, whether it's plastic or tailings from mines or whatever it is, you know, the enormous waste that we have. And much of the things that we do are degenerative, and we clearly have to move away from that. And then there are potentially neutral things where there's limited efforts to green the current system. But we're way beyond that being sufficient to deal with the challenges that we face. We've waited 50 years to act. These limited efforts might have been relevant in the 70s or 80s, but they're no longer enough. If we proceed in that way, we will have lost the battle we'll have lost the war before we start. So we have to move towards regenerative models where there's system transformation towards mitigation and regeneration. And so we need to be looking at all our initiatives to see how much are they degenerative, neutral, or regenerative, and where do they need to be taking action. And one of the ways we're proposing is in our evaluations, we look at these issues and we look at every initiative and think about how it can move in these regenerative directions. So, okay, so one of the points, so you can also think about the equity work and the work on creating a healthy planet. There's a model which is called the donut, which was developed by Kate Rayworth, where the outer edge of the donut is the planetary boundaries and what we're doing about those and how we're dealing with potential overshoots in those planetary boundaries. And we're overshooting 5 or 6 of those planetary boundaries now. And then what's the safe and just space for humanity, the social foundation, and how we can have a regenerative and distributive economy. And so you can look at issues around the provision of water, food, health, education, income, work, etc., as the inner part of the donut, and think about that more equity space linked to the climate and ecosystem space, which is on the outside. So these two are not divorced. So the 3 dimensions that we've been looking at on the climate ecosystem health is, first of all, thinking about whether the intervention that you're going to evaluate has any impact on climate and ecosystems health directly, whether it's through transport, through waste, through the use of resources, etc. But secondly, how has the impact of climate or ecosystems breakdown been thought through as to what that might mean for the intervention? So if there are floods, if there are droughts, if there are fires, how might this affect the intervention? And then the adaptive capacity of the intervention. Is the intervention bringing in ways to be able to build the capacity of management to adapt and respond to emerging issues. So the flexibility, and because what we're moving towards is increasing instability. You know, there's one quote I saw, which is this year is the most stable year you will ever live. It just gets increasing instability from here for at least the next 50 or 100 years. And this is the way in the guideline we express those three dimensions: the impacts on CEH of the resources consumed and the waste and pollution generated in the implementation of the intervention, the impacts of climate change and ecosystem degradation on the operation outcomes and sustainability of the intervention, and the extent to which the intervention design facilitates or inhibits the capacity of the intervention and its beneficiaries to adapt. And we also suggest a number of principles that we need to apply systems thinking, the awareness of interrelated systems within which the intervention operates and influences, being adaptable to account for evolution of climate and ecosystems breakdown, being prepared to address the systemic transformations that are needed, finding ways to integrate regenerative and restorative practices into the intervention and also in the way we conduct the evaluation, finding ways to bring in an educative component around climate and ecosystems into the intervention if it's appropriate. So for example, if you take the National School Nutrition Program, could there be some ways that as one of the aspects of it is feeding the children, but could you also be doing some education to the children about what healthy food is and how you produce food in ways which are good for the environment? Then identifying both the negative and positive consequences of the intervention on climate and ecosystems, and identifying opportunities for change and the skills needed. Intentionally exploring unintended consequences, and investigating how the power of different stakeholders affects their ability to act on CEH issues or has consequences for different groups. And being inclusive of the voices of those that are most affected or who have knowledge of the ecosystems affected. So I don't know if then there are any questions about the criteria and these principles, and then I'll do a little exercise for us to try and apply it. Any questions about the criteria? Not at this stage. There'll be a chance for more questions later. Okay, so let's leave it there then. I'll move on to the next. And you know, if there are questions about the criteria itself specifically, we can address those later. So then there's how we can actually apply these criteria in evaluations. And that's the real reason we've developed these guidelines, to help those commissioning evaluations and those undertaking evaluations understand how to do this. So the first thing is considering what this means for the purpose. You know, if you think that this intervention has strong links with climate and ecosystems health, you might actually want to reformulate the purpose of the evaluation to take this on explicitly. Secondly, how does this affect the scope? If you're, again, if there are strong links with climate and ecosystems, might we need to expand the scope of the evaluation to explicitly look at this? We would probably need to look at the evaluative questions, and Footprint has also done some really important work on looking at the key evaluation questions. We might then have to adapt the design and methodology of the evaluation. We might need to consider what resources are available to the evaluation, because we might need to look at some additional things in more depth, which might need more resources. And then we need to think about the management of the evaluation and the use of the evaluation results, and how we can try and make sure that that takes into account these changes that are needed around climate and ecosystems. So in terms of the scope, we might need to think about the time period that we're evaluating. We might need to think about how wide we cast the net, the stakeholders and elements that are included. We might need to think about the depth, how much depth we need to go into. And again, in terms of the climate ecosystems components, this will be affected by how strong we think the interactions with climate ecosystems are and in this. Now, what we've done in the guideline is you'll see we've tried to think about how the purpose statement might be adapted. So you can see the red there. So what we actually did is we took the DPME's guideline on developing terms of reference, and we said, well, now if we use that, and it has some questions, for example, that relate to the purpose of different types of evaluations, how might we change those if we're bringing in a climate and ecosystems dimension? So in this particular case, for a diagnostic evaluation, you might be saying, what is the current situation and root cause, and what are possible interventions to address it? And then if you're bringing in the climate and ecosystems, you might add, how does it relate to climate and ecosystems health issues? And then for each of these types of evaluations, we've got some questions that could be looked at. So that's diagnostic, that's design. And this is implementation. And so I'll just look at this one in a little bit more depth. So, for example, the core purpose of an implementation evaluation is likely to be something like, is the intervention being implemented as specified? Are the outcomes likely to be achieved and why? And of course, what changes do you think might be needed? But we might want to add, and are there likely to be positive or negative CEH outcomes? And similarly, how might those need to be mitigated? And so some of the questions you might want to bring in to thinking about this evaluation, and we're not suggesting you bring in all these questions, but we've given a menu of questions you might want to think about to prompt what might be questions that are relevant. What is the level of awareness of climate ecosystems health considerations among implementers and beneficiaries? During implementation, is there any explicit attempt to understand, mitigate, or adapt to CEH effects? For whom? Are CEH considerations reflected in implementation of the intervention, e.g. consumption patterns and practices or waste management? Whose interests are affected by a focus on CEH considerations? What CEH outcomes can be anticipated now and in the future? So these are some questions you might want to think about, whether you would want to add into what would otherwise be perhaps a more focused evaluation questions around the intervention itself. We're saying now you might want to bring in some additional questions which bring in the climate and ecosystems dimensions. And if we take the National School Nutrition Program, for example, the evaluation purpose was, the main purpose of the evaluation is to assess whether the NSNP is being implemented in a way that is likely to result in significant health and educational benefits to primary school learners. This one possible way to change is to bring on more CEH issues would be to add, and whether it could be implemented in a way that maximizes benefits to and reduces the impacts on climate and ecosystems health. So again, what we tried to do in the guideline is give some suggestions for people to think about, not say you must just do it this way, but to think about what you might want to add. Now I'm actually going to share a version we can actually enter into, because what I actually want to do now is I want to have a go at working together. So these were the NSNP evaluation questions. Is the program implemented as planned? Are operational procedures effective to ensure the timely delivery of food? Are learners receiving quality meals and services? What are the variations of implementation at different sites or by different provinces? Is the program reaching the intended beneficiaries? And is there evidence that NSNP enhances learning behavior, the likely impact of the program? So what I'm going to do is invite you to, if we take, let's take question 2. are operational procedures effective to ensure the timely delivery of food? Can you think of any ways we might want to modify this to take into account climate or ecosystems considerations? And you can either put in the chat or put up your hand. Or in fact, on any of them. I mean, if one comes to mind on another one, then raise it. Okay, so I see somebody's in the chat.
Low carbon,
transport.
low carbon transport.
Okay, so Tim, think about that as a question, how we might modify one of these questions to raise that issue. So you're thinking, I think, about the operational procedures. Are you there? So how might we modify the question so it would stimulate thinking about issues like low carbon transport? Thoughts? Okay, so Patricia's put, to what extent are food sources likely to be sustainable? Which question would you think that would come under, Patricia? Which one of those would we add to? Question 3. Okay, so let's add that in there. Okay, Tim, have you had any more thoughts on where you might bring in your point about low carbon, the question that would stimulate thinking about the transport?
Yeah, I'm still thinking.
Okay.
So Tamlin has put in maybe a question that explores the distances that suppliers need to travel to reach schools.
Okay, so again, Tamlin, what might be a question which would stimulate people to think about that issue? I mean, it could be something like a question, something like, how do operational procedures seek to limit climate or ecosystem impacts? And then obviously you'd have to look at what those might be, and then issues of transport might come up, or e.g. transport, for example.
I was thinking about, we could actually add a question to question 1. I've put it into the chat if you wanted to just copy it over, but like thinking about how has the program adjusted implementation, and to what extent were adjustments made in implementation due to factors in the environment or climatic conditions. So trying to understand, I mean, like for instance, I know in our projects with like with COVID, so it's not with climate necessarily, but we had to adapt our program for sure. So it's not, the program was not implemented as planned, but that's okay. But I think it would be good to get at
Exactly.
adaptation.
Agreed.
Yeah. Agreed.
And then Tim, do operational procedures for the timely delivery take steps towards e.g. it could be transport or limiting greenhouse gas emissions, etc. Yeah. I'm not, this is not necessarily the best formulation. I'm just trying to get the conceptual ideas in there. Yeah. So can one add to question 1, local sourcing of foods?
That might be more relevant in a way to question 4. Understanding, if there are different sites, different provinces, it speaks to the locality and I don't know.
So we could have, do these seek to consider climate ecosystem issues, e.g. local sourcing of food? Excuse my spelling there. How to shorten supply chains to lower, yeah, so to seek to limit, e.g. transport, shortening supply chains. Yeah. So what we need to find is the questions which are going to prompt this type of thinking, yeah, and which will make people think about the way their implementation is working and whether anybody has thought about doing it in a different way or try doing it with it, or how it could be done in a different way. What are the positive and negative CH effects on the program on beneficiaries? Okay. So
That's for 5, I think. Question 5.
Or 6. It's not just reaching.
Mm.
Yeah. So there's actually a limit. The question on outcomes is quite limited here. So you might even add, you might add it in there. So this is just reaching, which is quite, and what outcomes are they experiencing? Sorry, I pasted the wrong thing.
So Tim, you had asked in the chat about whether it's better to keep the questions more broad. And so some of the questions that are coming up are, and Ian, you can totally correct me, but they're more like the very specific questions that you might have in an interview. Whereas these questions are really the overarching guiding questions for the evaluation that would then help you figure out, okay, who do we need to talk to and what types of questions do we ask those people? So yes, so the broader questions actually are the ones that then create an umbrella for more specific questions that would be asked or investigated in different ways.
Yeah, so and sometimes so in a particular intervention, like this one, because food is a key thing in it, you might have some quite specific questions about food because it is about providing food. In other ones, it might be a broader one because you're trying to stimulate thinking and you want to consider a number of options. So
and also it is linked to the overarching purpose, right, of the evaluation. So this question that Marilyn has put in is quite an interesting one, but it would be very much dependent on if the evaluation purpose is looking at shifting from industrial farming to, let's say, permaculture and wanting to then gather evidence for that.
Yeah, so at the one level, do we end up changing the purpose of the evaluation? That could be one thing. Or we're just saying we're not changing the purpose, but we want to, in doing it, try and understand how much the program is intervening in a way which promotes climate and ecosystems health. In which case, for this particular one, the way the food is grown, I think, is a very important question. So I put here local sourcing of food, stroke using regenerative methods, stroke reducing transport. I think those are, for the National School Nutrition Program, those questions are critical ones. A lot of it is around transport, it is around production methods, it's around food, how you cook the food as well, because it could be what energy sources you're using to cook the food. That could be another area.
And Tamlin's put in one about dealing with the food waste.
Yes, exactly.
And that's
Okay,
excellent.
so,
yeah.
Yeah. And then there could be another question I think here, which is around education. You know, educating people about producing and cooking food in healthy ways, and also what food people eat. You know, education about issues around meat. I mean, beef is by far and away the industrial beef is by far and away the biggest producer of carbon emissions. Pig and chickens are much lower. So, you know, you can have all sorts of discussions where you have education around it as well. Yeah, so Tamlin input, education and behavior change. So you could you could even have, is there any attempt to educate learners around CEH issues, e.g. related to food? Yeah. Okay, so I think, and obviously if we have questions, if we start adjusting these evaluation questions, so Tebogo is saying we might want to look into quality. What would we be looking at for us to say it is a good quality or poor quality? Tebogo, what are you referring to in terms of quality? Oh, the quality meals, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, I'm referring to question 3. Good morning, everybody. Question 3, which says, are learners receiving quality meals and services? Because we then need to quantify what do you mean by quality. Is there a certain selected criteria for us to say, if you've met this particular criteria, then it means it's within quality? That's how we define our quality.
Yeah. And for example, yeah, and if the quality is, you know, do you say, is it all industrially produced stuff, food which has had a lot of vitamins taken out? I mean, highly processed food, for example, which is actually, you know, tends to cause obesity, or is it healthier food which is healthier for people to eat? So yeah, those questions can definitely be asked. Okay, so, and obviously by having the questions, by adjusting the questions in here, it's going to adjust what the evaluators do. It's going to adjust the methodology that's needed. It might adjust the resources that you need, because if you're going to follow up on some of these issues, you might need more time. For example, the waste question. If you're going to try and deal with the waste issue, you might need to go and look at it. In this case, it's probably not a big issue, but where you've got an intervention which is causing let's say an agricultural intervention which is resulting in pollution from fertilizers or pesticides, you might need to be able to take a downstream view of what's happening. So you might need to not just see the people immediately affected, but people that are affected downstream, or people that are affected by pesticides that you know, are beyond the immediate area that the farms that are being worked with, for example. So that might mean more costs. So so this will have some effect on how you do the intervention. Okay, there we go, as Jen is saying. Okay, so so we've had a bit of a play to sort of see that, and this, actually, if we in the actual guideline, this is what we put. We should also be. Okay, so I think you're very much getting the idea, and you know, there's no right or wrong way to formulate these, but it's just important that we start trying to think about how we bring these sort of issues in. So, I mean, just to leave you here with it. I mean, I think one of the things is, this is not just talking about people out there, it's also talking about ourselves and how we think about the world, the actions we're taking, and the actions we're taking in our own lifestyles. there are things we need to do ourselves to be credible in what we're saying. But we need to recognize we need to start thinking in systems with a focus on humanity as part of nature and how we can regenerate our world. So that would affect the way we are operating in our organizations, the way we think about relationships between people, as well as relationships with the planet, how the decisions we take to include climate ecosystems and equity issues actually into M&E practice, and then how we can seek to apply the CEH and equity guidelines in all of our evaluations. And there's a potential to collaborate with SAMIA and DPME on pilots and in the COP. And how you start to think about building adaptation and resilience into all your interventions. So I think that's as far as I've got here. And then I think just any further questions that people have got. And apologies about the presentation. What happened is I tried to reduce the file size, and in the end, what I realized is that it actually corrupted the presentation. So I had to go back to an earlier version. Any questions people have got? Tamlin?
Well, yeah? Not so much a question, Ian, just a comment and some reflections. And just firstly to say thank you to you and Jen for doing this session on a Saturday and for your efforts, your team's efforts in doing this this document. I think it's really laudable, and I think it's imperative. And I really like that it's focusing on mainstreaming these debates in evaluation and policy. I think it's great, and I do a lot of climate change work in my projects, and I'm based here in Durban. So I think the other thing, just skimming through the document this morning, I mean, there are some obvious challenges in implementing this, but I think the guidelines document identifies them already. So immediately when I thought about this before looking at the doc, some of my first thinking was around, well, yes, exactly. If you take a project or an intervention that's already got an environmental focus, then it's a lot easier. But if you've got a project that's not obvious, it's not obvious what the ecological impacts would be, or maybe you've even got a project or an intervention that's causing severe damage to the environment, then it's going to be a lot harder to sort of apply this. And then the thinking as well, I mean, around like adding questions, adds time, adds budget, you need the expertise. So I like that your final slide was saying that the change starts with us. So we need to educate ourselves, empower ourselves around climate change, around some of these debates. We need to make that paradigm shift and be activists ourselves, actually, to do this kind of work and do it properly. So I think the only thing maybe that I didn't see coming up, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just thinking about the floods here in Durban, and you know, we're working in the Warwick market, and we're working with informal workers, and it's a climate change, it's got a clear goal, our project, it's around zero waste and climate change mitigation, right? But obviously what we're finding is people have very different understandings of climate change, which I think we all understand. I mean, you spoke a lot about climate change denialists, and they are out there, people that are deliberately distorting information. But there's also a lot of cultural and ancestral understandings around like extreme weather events, for example, like the flooding. So you need to also be sensitive to those and find a way where the science and these more traditional views can interface. Because, for example, there were some informal workers in the market when it flooded who saw the event as something spiritual, almost like we've upset the ancestors, and that's why you know, we need to intervene by making a sacrifice and you know, not really making those scientific links. Although there's potential there to maybe bridge those understandings, but that's something that you have to work through. So there's a lot of education, I think, and advocacy around climate change that's needed, and finding narratives that speak to people in a way that they understand. So it might not be positioning climate change in terms of the science like we sort of think about it, a lot of us think about it, but focusing on where it touches people, so around health, around health impacts that people can understand. So that was one thought, and then I mean, about the broader system that's just not geared at the moment for these kind of changes, and how do we deal with the government, for example, where there's a lot of officials that are actually buying into these false solutions. So we've got to be clear about that. I mean, there's a whole continuum of solutions, some that are better than others, and we sit in different places on those. But things like incineration, it's a false solution. So just thinking about some of those attitudes as well. But I think you've done a really good job. If we can just get over some of these hurdles and some of the obstacles that you've identified in the guidelines, I think it's something it's really important. It's worth pursuing, even though it's not going to be easy to integrate this criterion across all evaluations. But I think it's worth having a stab in the spirit of trying to mainstream and educate everyone on this crisis. And get us thinking about it, because I think automatically, if the project wasn't environmentally aligned, people would sort of see it as an add-on. But I guess it's to try and get us all thinking that this is not an add-on, that the environmental collapse is going to affect all our interventions. It really is having consequences. So it is integral, but because it's so cross-cutting, sometimes it's hard to sort of see those effects. But thank you. That was just some thoughts. Thanks very much for making time today.
Okay, so I'm going to have to go, but I just wanted to just respond to Nkwazi. Nkwazi, definitely we have to start thinking in much more system ways to see the interactions between what we're doing rather than see things as isolated interventions. And that's one of the challenges, because there's costs and whatever that are associated with it. And we've also got to learn how to do that. We've got to develop methodologies, etc., and ways of planning and M&E that will facilitate that. So I think, just following up from Tamlin Singh, I think that the point is that the problem is so urgent that we need to bring this front and center into all that we're doing. We need to be thinking about this in our organizations, in our families, in our personal lives. What do we do? Because if we don't act quickly, our children and our grandchildren will say, why did you not act? Because we're the last generation that can actually act to do this. Beyond us, the impacts will just devastate down the generations. So we must act quickly, and we've got to do it in all of our professions, M&E being one of them. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. I know you have to go. We can, for everyone else, we can stay on. I can give you a little bit of more information around some of what we're doing in Samia, and there's another community of practice that focuses specifically on this work. I have some questions for you to really help us think about, as Tamlin was raising, like, how do we do this? There are the guidelines, but as practitioners, how do we do this? So let's stay on the conversation. Ian needs to go. Thank you very much, Ian. And if you can, just send us a fixed version of the presentation that we can then share with people, that would be great.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Yes, so just really briefly, like, we have the two criteria and guidelines. Last year, we started a process of piloting them with a couple of government evaluations. One with the Department of Social Development, looking at a food systems, a food security program, and then another with the Department of Science and Innovation, where they're evaluating the water research and development roadmap. And it's a very slow process, but we're trying to use this as a way of really testing out the 2 criteria and the guidelines. But what is also missing is like from the practitioner's side, what does this mean? So Tamlin, as you were kind of raising, like how do we start using this type of way of thinking, and how would we actually start applying this type into our work? And maybe Tamlin, I mean, there are some of you here, I'm sure, who have actually started this process already of like thinking about how to integrate climate and ecosystems issues into evaluations. So I was wondering if there's anybody who wants to kind of talk about how you've already tried to tackle this, what learnings you have. And Tamlin, definitely appreciate also what you were saying about the different ways of knowing and different knowledge systems. Taku, who was on the call earlier, but is not on at the moment, he's very much interested in Made in Africa evaluation and taking into consideration these different ways of knowing. And I think that is really critical. I think it is in the guidelines, but it needs to certainly be something that is more forefronted. But we are now at a point of really open conversation. Any further reflections, questions? So we have quite a number of people on here, I think for the first time, and you might have missed the introduction. So this is the SAMIA KZN Monitoring and Evaluation Network. We have monthly meetings on a Saturday morning where we try to engage in ways of learning and building our knowledge and our capacity as monitoring and evaluation enthusiasts. So welcome. And maybe just so we do still have an hour or so of our own meeting. You are welcome to stay and engage, or if you need to drop, you're also welcome to drop. But yeah, I was really curious about how people wanted to what you thought about the presentation, and another question that I have is like, what would help you as a practitioner to really be better able to apply these dimensions into your work?
I see Jane Timothy's got a question in the chat regarding streamlining guidelines. Maybe we could talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Tim, what do you what are you thinking?
I was just thinking that I'm wondering, us as evaluators, we generally do a midline evaluation or an end line. And if we come in at that point with all of these guidelines, the program is already far down the road in terms of how it's being designed. And then in a way, it's almost unfair in a sense that we are then judging the evaluation by trying to have agenda is the wrong word, but we're trying to promote, all of these aspects that are in the guidelines for the betterment of society, broadly speaking. But we're not necessarily doing the program justice because it might not have been designed in alignment with those guidelines in the beginning, in the first place. And I'm wondering how can we affect the design of the program before it's even hit the ground, long before an evaluation could have been conducted. And I mean, maybe even doing a clarifactory evaluation is too late anyway, because that usually happens at midline too. So how can we get involved with the people who are designing the program, the institutions, maybe the commissioners, to try to sort of implement these guidelines very, very early on in the thinking of how the program will be rolled out? I've got no idea what the answer is to that. So I'm just posing that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. So in the process of developing the guidelines, yeah, so the guidelines are written, as Ian said, they're based on the DPME's guidelines on terms of reference for evaluations. So it's very much geared towards commissioners, with a little bit towards the evaluators that would be assigned to the task. But yes, it is definitely, I mean, although in the TOR structure, it talks about diagnostic and design evaluations, as you say, like they're more, generally the evaluations are done more at like mid-level, kind of midterm or at the end. And so in a lot of the discussions, there have been people who have raised issues around, okay, well, we need to get this into planning. And so we have, as SEMEA, we have started engaging with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in their planning unit around this and the planning side. But that's like government at government level. And also at government level, like Ian's been working with Department of Social Development on kind of institutionalizing these concepts around just transition into their program planning. And we had a call the other day with somebody who's responsible for disaster management. And so looking at, yeah, how to be building in these issues into at more of a planning stage. But it's a really important question, and something that I think as we carry on, I think it becomes more and more real to people, and then it will start getting put into the thinking from the beginning. Another in our recent community of practice meeting on this just transition work, we were talking about how we need to also adjust the guidelines and share them with like funding agencies. You know, so if they're the ones that are putting out calls for projects, whether it's for programs or for evaluations, that as they start thinking about this, and a lot of them do have, you know, they recognize climate change as a key issue, but they don't necessarily have a structure maybe for how it would be evaluated. That also could be where it's then guiding how programs are developed, designed. I don't know if Tamlin or Patricia, if anybody else has a response.
Okay, let Patricia talk. We unmuted at the same.
Oh, go ahead. I'll wait for you. Please go first.
Oh, Patricia, I was just trying to save Jen a little bit because she's talking so much on her own. I don't know if I had anything clever to say. I mean, I think the question is really important, and it speaks to this broader paradigm shift that's needed, and what role can evaluators really play in this, because all programs in the ideal world should be designed so that they're thinking about climate change and ecosystem health, but that's not necessarily the case. So yeah, it's a really tricky question. I mean, we can, as evaluators, what is our role? So maybe like Jen's saying, sharing the documents with funders, that might help. I mean, these things do have to be thought about at the planning stage. So I don't really have I don't have an answer, Patricia, but what are your thoughts?
I see this as two parts to it, because one of them is, even if you are doing a midterm or an end of line, and sometimes people say it's not fair, you know, to evaluate a program in terms of something other than its goals. And I think Timothy raised that. And I think that's something as evaluators that we need to push back on, that, you know, on the one hand, managers manage to manage their goals, to achieve their goals. So it's not saying, well, actually it's been doing serious environmental harm and that matters and it's not been good, is different to saying you didn't achieve your objectives. And I think the whole issue of the ethics about unintended outcomes and unintended impacts is, has been talked about in evaluation, and there's I think a stand you need to make on this to say it's not enough just to, did you meet your goals? Evaluation is not just measuring whether goals have been met, that it really should be about helping decision makers to make more informed decisions that include clarifying the values, and that, having massive negative effects is not okay. And so, over time, as that becomes more evident, then that will affect design. But as Ian very clearly made the point, we don't have a lot of time on that. So somehow this has got to come into the planning processes. And it's got to be done in a way that's not a tick and flick saying, oh yes, well, we put all our post-it notes in the recycling bin, so tick, we're environmentally sustainable. Like, how do you help people to focus on things that are actually going to make a difference? And I think, as a resource, we need, as evaluators who don't have environmental backgrounds, how do we get enough information to help focus on important things? How do we get technical advice or whatever to, look at things that do make a difference? That's what I would say.
Thanks, Patricia. Yeah, it speaks a bit to how we perceive like the role of evaluation, where some people see it as being very much for advocacy, for like pushing for social justice, or is it just, as you were saying, the other side being, it's just measuring performance. But evaluation is very value laden, right? Or we would think it should be. And Tamlin said in the chat that that we all have a role to play in terms of at least educating stakeholders on these issues. And so also, yeah, maybe part of it is just, having, if we have this lens as we go about doing our work, and that it will influence some of the questions that we might ask or the recommendations that we make, perhaps that also helps to start steering the way of thinking. So Tamlin, sorry to put it back. Since you were saying you had kind of skimmed through the guidelines a little bit, and I know because of the work that you've been doing with the Zero Waste Project and applying the developmental evaluation to that work, if you were to be applying these dimensions for CEH, what would you feel like you would need to make it something easier to actually apply? Like, would there be tools that you are looking for, or have you come across any tools in your work that would be useful for growing our capacity in this area?
I think, Jen, with this particular project that I'm working on, because it's it's funded by climate activists, it's implemented by climate activists. The main goal is to grow the climate movement and to demonstrate zero waste as viable climate change solutions. So we're very focused on climate change mitigation. I mean, we need to demonstrate that. So it's maybe not the greatest example, because we all, we're aligned to this criterion completely. And in every decision we make, there's enough people in the room that are sensitive to these issues that every decision, I mean, we have catering, a stupid example, catering, there's no plastic. We have to educate the caterers. We have to be really sticky about where we go, where we hold things. Flying becomes a really huge issue. We have to calculate the carbon, and every decision really. So it's not a good example. I mean, I think it's going to be harder for people that are not working on projects that have a distinct environmental focus. So for them, what would be useful, I think, and I think somewhere in the guidelines you do speak about how Samir has set up like peer learning groups and communities of practice around trying to, I think that, I mean, even this little exercise we did around the school nutrition program, just getting and brainstorming the harder case studies in a group to see exactly how this would apply. I think that would be helpful for me if I wasn't, if I was working on a project that it was harder to sort of apply these guidelines. And then having some people, I guess, in the room that have some experience and some knowledge around climate change, that could help, I guess, as well, because there are a lot of myths and misunderstandings. So I guess then it comes back to that sort of point that I made when I was rambling, is like we have to, I think, become climate change activists ourselves before we can really take this on and do it justice. We have to understand the issues. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Hi, Silma. I saw you had a comment in response to Timothy's question around the need about the issue around planning. I don't know, we've not met before, but you said that, yes, programs need to be designed correctly. Maybe, do you have any examples of where you've tried to integrate these issues into your work, or where you have struggled to do so? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if there's any other thoughts or comments or questions. I have put in the chat earlier, where you can access the two guidelines. And yeah, so we do have we have another community of practice on M&E for Just Transition, where we really are trying to just tackle with how to develop our own knowledge and our own skills around this, as well as looking at more kind of piloting on integrating these criteria into evaluations, but then also looking at integrating them into kind of planning and monitoring systems. There's been some discussion around really needing to do some mapping exercises where we can just really start mapping out what exists already. Footprint evaluation has already done quite a bit of that, so we should be actually looking at that quite a bit more. So if people are interested, you can find that information on Samia's website. I'll also put my email address. You can email me and I can give you more information on that. For that meeting, we meet during the week for also around 2 hours. We also have a session, a small group within that's looking at private sector and impact investing, if you're interested in those areas. Yeah, and then you're very much welcome to join in on other meetings that we have for this KZN MEL network. In the coming months, we're going to also have Donna Podum speak on feminist evaluation, which should be another really interesting discussion. We had a small group discussion on it a few weeks ago, and people really were quite surprised that even a man can be a feminist. But yes, you can. So Yeah, and there's lots of different other activities that are happening with SAMEA. So if you're not already familiar with SAMEA, you can check out the website and get involved. And yeah, Patricia, please do share some materials on Footprint. Send us, you can give us a little bit more on the website and your frameworks, your ways of thinking.
Yeah. Oh, I think I tried to paste too many at once. They've all run together. I mean, we're obviously working on, you know, working in the same direction in terms of this, and you've done a lot of work on how do you embed it in government. We've done a lot of work on the nuts and bolts on how do you do it on an individual evaluation. So there's a section on the Better Evaluation website that has one of the themes, and then there's sort of 3 cases that people might find helpful. One was something we started with really early, which were thought experiments, which was a really helpful exercise to go back to an evaluation we knew that hadn't looked at environment and said, if we had, would it have picked up something important? Would it have been useful? And then, and how could we have done that in a feasible way? So we've talked about these 4 examples that we found really helpful. And then we've done some real examples. One was we worked with Uganda's review of their national strategy for private sector development. So that was absolutely not about the environment, and yet they wanted it to be aligned with their national development plan, which does have environmental goals. So it was still legitimate to be you know, on the agenda, and so that's I think it was a really helpful case study to do, to look at the environmental sustainability as a cross-cutting issue, and it did highlight some issues. And we talked about how we sort of scaled that and focused on a particular, not everything, but a few big issues. And then we've just published one looking at the environmental impacts of personal protective equipment during COVID. And you know, that's another one where it's not, you're not saying you shouldn't use it, because clearly that was critically important for health, but you know, what should have been done and could be done in the future to be environmentally more sustainable and achieve better health outcomes. So, you know, there's stuff there that people might find nuts and bolts, because it's much more about how do you do an evaluation. Complements a lot more about your saying, how do you get it into the machinery of government? And you need all of this and more.
Right. So you can, if you're interested, you can join the Footprint. You can get the newsletters by going on to betterevaluation.org and sign up. And there's a number of resources there that are very useful. And with Footprint, we assume that we're going to be doing a global session looking at the 2, where the discussion on Uganda will be presented as well. Great. And Nokwazi, I saw your comment about integrating it into, can you just tell us what the EDTEA is, please? Acronyms. Acronyms are good and bad at the same time.
Sorry about that. It's economic development, tourism, and environmental affairs.
Great. Yes, so very much. That'll be very interesting, where we can definitely talk further on how to do that. There was a presentation at the KZN evaluation seminar on these guidelines, but very much happy to engage with you further. Okay, well, if there isn't anything else, we can close early. Tamlin, I don't know if you want to stay on and just chat quickly about upcoming, or if that's something that we can do later. Okay.
We can stay we can stay on here, and I don't mind. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great morning. have a good Earth Day, and I hope you have your thinking caps on and figuring out how. I mean, it really is. It's a learning. I've been learning so much in the past year or so, but still, there's really so much more to learn, especially in the practical side of how to do this. And yeah, both as a monitoring and evaluation person, but just as an individual, I have a lot to learn. Yeah. Okay, great.
Me too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.